Hey everybody, and welcome to Bible Study That Doesn't Suck. This is Pastor Megan in San Francisco at Grace Lutheran, where we have worship every Sunday at 10:30 a.m. live and live streamed. And I'm very sleepy because I had a lot of meetings yesterday. Pastor Amanda is away today, due to a death in the family, and so send prayers of love and support and hope and light and whatever is your preferred method of sending well wishes to her and her family. And over in the unicorn room.
Hi, I'm Pastor Finn. I am with Queer and Sacred Spaces in Portland, Oregon. I'm doing mission development within the queer and transgender community. Our next meeting will be on November 4th here at Unicornitopia. And we will also be having a music circle or a song circle every second Sunday at Arbor Lodge Coffee Shop here in North Portland as well. And you're welcome to join us for that song and storytelling time beginning the second Sunday of November.
And are you playing with change in your hand?
I'm sorry, rocks. I'll stop playing with my rocks.
Oh, okay. It was making like a noise that I just wanted to figure out what it was.
There's lots of trucks that pass by because we live right next to where all the UPS trucks go through to get on the freeway.
Every once in a while, you hear screaming and or laughing and or playing babies out the window. So
we don't live in quiet cells of communal living.
Yeah,
in the middle of the world.
So Job text, we talked a lot last week about the Job text, probably, so we don't need to spend a lot of time here. Particularly the thing I wanted to lift up was last week when Pastor Amanda was talking about how this week's reading is made up after the fact. The idea that the communities that read the text were very unsettled by the fact that God took away all of this stuff from Job and that it was unfair, and that the need, the unending, unstoppable desire to go back and rewrite the text and then say, and then all this stuff happened too, and it got better. While it might have, we don't know. This desire to go back and write it back into the text and have a happy ending is one that many people who produce movies sometimes have to go back and switch the endings of their movies when executives aren't happy or when screening audiences wish for a happy ending to the text. And that's what happens in this space. The Gospel of Mark also has a similar encounter. The Gospel of Mark, there is an announcement of the resurrection and an empty tomb, but no Jesus sightings. And people went back because they felt internally itched and like they just were agitated enough that they needed stories of Jesus resurrecting and walking around and proof that it had in fact happened. And so they wrote those stories back in later. And so if you are someone whose faith comes in a way where you believe that Jesus was a great faithful person who enacted justice in the world, and you aren't really sure if he was resurrected and came back to life, then maybe you are a Markan Christian. Maybe you are someone who is okay with the story ending with an empty tomb and the mystery remaining. And other people might really want that additional ending on the story, or might be Lucan or Johnian or Matthew. I don't know how you Mathanian. I don't know how you would say it. You might love Matthew the best, but just know that there are options despite the way that they are all merged together. And it's going to happen more and more and more and more as we get closer to December, because so many of those Christmas movies, they're like, oh, this part in Luke, that's fun, let's do that part. Oh, this part from Matthew, that's really pretty, let's add that. Oh, this part in John is weird. Right? Or the Bible movies. If you've seen the Bible movies that were on the History Channel, they even take bits and they put them back into the Old Testament parts of the stories. Like there's a bit where Abraham is up on top of the mountain and he's about to slaughter Isaac, his son, because God told him to, and he was dumb enough to do it. And off in the corner, they zoom into the next hill and Jesus is watching, because the Gospel of John said that from the beginning of time, Jesus was around. And so why couldn't Jesus be watching, right? And so people have rewritten the stories in the ways that they see their faith living in the world. We have no way of proving if any of these are right or if any of these are wrong. All we all have is faith. And faith is not a way of saying, we know it's exactly this way. In fact, the definition of faith is we can't prove it. We can't know it. It's a hunch that we have deep in our gut and we go with it. And some people try to develop their faith or guide their faith in a certain direction. Like, I'd like to believe more like this group of churchy people whom I respect. And that's great. We all have like goals and can work towards them. There are other people who are like, my faith is good enough just climbing mountains every once in a while and going, man, this is a beautifully complicated world. I'll never be able to figure it out. And other people's faith is not something they have a lot of time to pay attention to because they're so busy. Their work life is so busy and congested that they don't have what I like to call the privilege to ponder, which is just pastors sitting around being like, I wonder what this verse means and if this word meant that. Like, we get the time to just all week think about what these texts mean. Not that we're not busy or not that we're not working, but we have the privilege to ponder. And so some people don't have the same privilege to ponder. They live in an emergency a lot of their time. And sometimes the people who are living in emergency have the most time to think about God, as we'll see in so many of our texts that are about people who are homeless or people who are really vulnerable. And so wherever you find yourself on any of these scales, it's okay. You can think Job is an amazing book of the Bible. You can think Job is the dumbest book of the Bible. That's okay with me. I think it's okay with God, but I don't know yet. We'll find out.
So there's room for multiple perspectives.
Yeah, the other thing to know about Job is that Job is it's a trilogy. It's a three-packaged, it's designed to be read with 3 books. Not that there's like Job part 2. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that it's a collection called the wisdom literature. And it's meant to be read with, first you read Proverbs, then you read Job, and then you read Ecclesiastes. So this is the middle portion. And if I said to you, go watch the middle of that movie, don't watch the beginning, don't watch the end, just watch the middle of that movie, right? Because usually stories are designed to go like this, right? We've got, here's a little bit about what's going on. Here's some sort of conflict. Here's a resolution. Yay, happy ending, right? That's pretty typically the way kind of story arcs go. And so you're reading the middle point, and that's the like long journey part. It's not the resolution part. And so you got to read Ecclesiastes for that part. And the Ecclesiastes is a lot of stuff about what the Holy Spirit is up to. And if you need encouragement to read the book of Ecclesiastes, my favorite part is that at one point in the book of Ecclesiastes, the Holy Spirit is a man. And then out of nowhere, with no explanation, the Holy Spirit becomes a woman. And then the Holy Spirit, I think, becomes a man again. And despite being a man, is still described with female gendered language. So that's fun. Look for that in the book of Ecclesiastes. But just know that it's a part of a collection of readings, in the same way that if you just read the beginning of a Paul letter and you only read the part where he's like, because Paul letters are all kind of in a similar formula where Paul will say, well, hey, everybody, it's good to see you. You're really great. Oh, yeah. Nice church. It's pretty. And then he'll be like, don't you hate when blah, 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 blah? Have you ever been a part of a conversation and everyone's like, oh, I hate it. Don't you hate the way AOL's dial-up goes, right? And you tell some sort of story and you bond by all hating the same thing. And it's not necessarily like a mean conversation or bullying. It's just like, oh, I am so annoyed how much election mail I get. It's such a waste of paper, right? We all bond by hating the same thing. And it actually, in our bodies, physiologically, what happens when we enjoy hating something in a group is the same release of chemicals that happens when you take depression medications. Those same chemicals are released when you share hating something with someone. Have you ever felt really good after you got to vent? It's a similar kind of euphoria that comes out of the chemicals in your body. There's lots of other ways you can also create those chemicals. Some are unhealthy, but hating something that's not hurting someone else, where you all join in venting at something inanimate, can be really healthy and awesome. So some of these texts of the Bible are like, I hate this, and this, and this, and this, and this. Well, so Paul starts his letters off that way. Don't you hate blah, 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 blah. They're the worst. Unfortunately, some people just take that small section of Paul's writing and they're like, Paul's a jerk. He just hates everybody, and we should hate those people too. It's not what's going on, because Paul keeps going in his story, and Paul kind of turns the tables on everybody, because he'll go, right, you're with me, we all hate that, it's horrible, and then he'll go, but everything was made equal in Christ and we can't hate it anymore, and they are some of the most valuable people in God's kingdom, right? And so Paul uses this model of telling a story to turn it all on its head and say, yay, God is with us, Jesus is with us, Jesus supports us. But if you only stop at just one part of the story, you get a very different message. If you just have the beginning, it's like, yeah, we're great. Paul said we're great. We're the best church ever. We don't have to work on anything. If you just look at the middle section, it's like, oh, those people are horrible. We should be mad at those people forever and tell them they can't be like that anymore. And if you just read the end, you just hear that everything is equal and God loves you. Sounds good to me. Let's do that part. Right? So we can find ways that we can communally vent together, or I was on the phone with one of the members of our congregation who is spending a lot of time at home right now because of some medical complications, and she was telling me how much she really was missing getting the church gossip. And I said to her, well, when you hear it from the pastor, it's church news, not church gossip. So we can take that enjoyment we have of telling stories about what's going on and who's doing well and who's not doing well, but channel it towards all of our health. And so find things that you can vent about together. You can actually practice this as a group. If you go in a circle and everyone just says, hi, my name is Megan. And you know what I hate? I hate paper cuts. And then everyone in the room together will go, oh, that's the worst. And you'll think it's a really silly exercise, but you go around every person, and no matter what it is that they say, you take off your politically correct, right? No matter what it is that they say, and most people pick silly, benign things, everyone in the room will just say, I hate that. It's the worst. And you would imagine that people would get grumpier and angrier, but that's not the case. As you go around the circle, people start laughing because these chemicals in their bodies start making them happy and feeling euphoric. And people feel bonded in a way that even if they didn't know anyone, right? So I encourage people, if you're going to do icebreakers, it makes us all feel nervous when we have to tell some sort of interesting story or something really great about ourselves. Go the opposite direction. Try having everyone say something that they hate. I know. It's not what we normally think we would do, but try it just once. See what happens. That's what I think about.
Oh, tell us? Or what?
What was that?
And then what? How do you recover from that? And then turn it around like Paul?
No, then you have your meeting. And then at the end of the meeting, you say something that you love. And as you're departing from each other, everyone says, my name is... You can do their names again. You can be like, my name is Megan. And you know what I love? I love soy hot chocolates from Starbucks. And then everyone in the circle, no matter if they love it or not, has to say, I love that. I love that so much. Right? And if for some reason the group is brought down at the end of the like, oh, that's the worst circle, you can do the I love it right away. But I promise you, after you go around and everyone says, oh, that's the worst, it gets out all of the stuff and people will be more positive in the meeting. Just try it, because the idea of complaining about something no longer feels like it's foreboding, and people have less anxiety about bringing up things like, oh, I feel really uncomfortable if we do this thing. I think it might hurt the feelings of so-and-so. People might feel more able to name problems rather than just like not naming out loud what might hurt them. Just try it. Just see what happens. Who knows? Just saying. Just a little something. I don't know. Do you have anything else you want to say about Job?
I don't have anything else to say about Job. I didn't read Job.
Yeah, Job.
I know, Job. Job.
The psalm is interesting. And the only reason the psalm is interesting, I don't know if it's the only reason. There's probably a million reasons it's interesting. But Pastor Amanda would want us to point out that this psalm is an acrostic. And each line begins with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet, right? And I don't know the Hebrew alphabet well enough to go through what all the letters are. But let's imagine that it goes A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, N, O, P, all the way down. It's interesting because if I was going to write an acrostic poem, number one, I don't think I've written an acrostic poem since I was in like the 4th grade, right? Or if it was like Mother's Day, this is like a Mother's Day kind of present, like mom, right? And then you like say good things about mom based on the letters of mom. So imagine this, right? So when you're trying to pray to God, know that sometimes even the smartest, most religious, most sacred people ran out of stuff to say. And they're like, I got nothing. I'm just going to write down the alphabet and come up with some stuff that comes out of the alphabet. So like, that's fun, right? And the other thing that is interesting is, so they do the Hebrew alphabet, and then, but they don't do it like we would if we were like, I love mom. We would write nice stuff all along there, right? This psalm is the Hebrew alphabet, and it's all of the scarcity and the diseases that the people of God experience. It would be like if a geeky doctor person, I love geeky, so I'm using that as a lovely pronoun. But it would be like if someone who was a nurse came and you said, here's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, all the way to Z. And you said, write me a funny poem about medical diseases that have plagued humanity and poverty, right? How often would you think in your like the Psalms are kind of our model for prayer. So if you think I can't pray in the word, I don't know how to pray because I don't know the right words to use, know that at one point someone wrote a prayer that was the letters of the alphabet and different diseases. So anything else you pray, I feel like is okay. Right? If someone put in our sacred holy book, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, these are diseases that bother me, right? And rhymey like that, like it's like Sesame Street praying. Then we can pray any darn way that we want to. And so go back to some of those, like even if you don't have anything to pray, even the like, now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. Just, you know, kids rhymes, it's okay. One of the things that I've been doing each night, except for once, and then I got in trouble, is I've been praying on Twitter. And I believe that we are allowed to pray for pious things, right? We can pray for the things we think ought to be prayed for, like an world peace everywhere. We all want to pray for that. Some of us have given up because we don't think it's possible, right? So we can pray for those things we obviously know that faithful people should pray for. But I also think we can pray for silly things. I'll often pray that all of my stress will turn to chocolate. That's a good one. If that came true, that would be more miraculous than a lot of other, like I couldn't prove a medical miracle, but if my stress turned to chocolate, I would know God was with us. So I think we should pray for that one more often. Right? And so I want to encourage people, you can pray for silly things. You're allowed to pray for selfish things. Some people have been told that they can't pray for themselves, that they should only pray for other people, and they feel guilty about it. And so know that if you can't figure out how to pray, you could pray just A, B, C. Like, think of a thing you want to pray for with all those letters. Wouldn't that be great? If you're on a long road trip, you know how you try to come up with words that start with different letters, and families play games in the car, like find the license plate from each of the 50 states. You could do that one time through with prayers if you wanted to be like Psalm 34. Ooh, new fun kids car game. I bet that's going to catch on. What do you think, Finn?
Oh, absolutely. I'm sure everyone's going to do that.
There you go. Hebrews. You want to talk Hebrews?
Sure.
Should we talk about the order of Melchizedek? I'm sure Finn knows the entire history of Melchizedek. Nobody knows the history of Melchizedek. Not only do people not know the history of Melchizedek, people do not know how to pronounce Melchizedek when they read this in church on Sunday. If you get it wrong, it's okay. However you pronounce it, just go with it. Pretend you're confident when you say it, and everyone else will think that you know, and they'll spend their time trying to memorize the way you said it because you said it so confidently. That must be the way it's said.
What's the scripture? Because I'm looking at something else. Hebrews.
I have Hebrews 7:23 through 28, but let me see if that's the same. Yeah. So.
Okay.
So, well, this is a part of a whole big long thing. So last week was when it explicitly talked about the order of Melchizedek, and this is like the continuation of talking about what the order of Melchizedek means. So I'll just give you a brief idea about what that is, and then we can talk about like what it actually says in the text. So there was this guy named Melchizedek. And he's mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we know that it was a particular type of the Judeo lineage and scholarship. And so Abraham, when he was wandering around the earth, whenever he would pillage different communities as his way to be given the promised land by God. We don't mention that very often. When people talk about, oh, God's going to give me this promised land, that really meant like pillaging and destroying communities in order to take the promised land from other people. And they meant that God was going to grant them victory in like a bloody battle. So whenever Abraham would go and like slaughter a town, ooh, Abraham, he would give 10%. Does that sound familiar? 10% tithing, right? We think of tithing to God, right? Well, Abraham tithed to a guy named Melchizedek, and he was a king and a priest, but he was not, so there were different faiths and there were different kinds of priests. So it's kind of like if you think about the Pope. The Pope is descended from the line of Peter, supposedly, right? And the Vatican is located where it is because they believe that the basilica, the St. Peter's Basilica, is directly above the tomb of Peter. And we can't prove it 100%. Some guy named Peter, David have a grave that was right there, and that's the place where it was written that Peter had been murdered or executed. Right? So the Pope comes from the line of Peter. Did you know in Egypt, they also have their own Pope, a completely different Pope. So the Coptic Christians have a Pope that descends from a completely different line. So Peter was one of the disciples. Each of the disciples went out into the world, into different parts, and Paul went through parts of Africa, and there are disciples that they think went through China, and there's all these little maps about where they think the disciples went. And when they taught, each one of those communities followed different disciples, and so they have their lineage of how amazingly just the best of the best their pastors are, and everyone tries to descend themselves back to the disciples. That's called the episcopate, which is the name where the Episcopal Church comes from, right? So the idea in the Episcopal Church is that, someone who listened to God and was really smart made someone else a pastor by laying hands on them, and then they laid hands on someone else, and then they laid hands on someone else, and then they laid hands on someone else. And so all these different branches of faith or popes their genealogy as priests goes back through the laying on of hands all the way back to the time of Jesus. And they fight with each other in the same way that in our gospel text, the disciples fought with each other. So you can imagine if everyone you went to high school with somehow became like it was something really amazing happened in your high school. Let's imagine someone in your high school becomes the president. And then the news people come and they want to talk to you because you went to high school with the new president. And they say, well, tell us about the president. And you would tell your memories from 20 years ago about what that president was like when they were in high school. And all of your other classmates would also get to tell stories about what that person was like in high school. And if you just think of the different stories people might have had about you in high school, or even that you had about yourself in high school, I thought I was going to be a very different person 20 years into the future than I turned out to be. And so all of these stories would create really different ways of being in the world. And that's how people talked about Jesus. So one of these lines is not Melchizedek, because Melchizedek is before Jesus, right? We're talking back during the time of Abraham. So they also had all of these priests who were descendant, and there were some priests who were ranked based on the names of their parents. And so they were like kings, and you got to be the next pastor of this sacred space because your dad had been the pastor, the rabbi in that sacred space, right? And so some of the priests got to be in that space because they had the lineage from their parents. Some priests got to be in that space because they were great rabbis, and you'd pick them, you'd vote on it. And Melchizedek, they say, is a great priest who has no parents, no mother, no father, right? So does not become a priest based on lineage, but becomes a priest based on being a great priest. And different congregations, and if you think about the way pastors work in different interfaith groups, there are some places we can think of like ministries that are of people on TV. Your dad used to be the minister here, now you're the minister here because you've got the right last name. So this is one way of saying, and Melchizedek, by the way, was called, because Melchizedek did not have a mom or a dad, Melchizedek was called the Son of God. Sound familiar? Right? So there's this idea that there are some people who have power and strength based on their relationship to their family. And there are other people who have power and strength based on their relationship and their appointment by God. And that doesn't necessarily mean we think Melchizedek went poof out of thin air and just appeared one day and existed in the world, but that Melchizedek maybe is an orphan. Or Melchizedek maybe said, like St. Francis. St. Francis goes and says, even though he had a wealthy family, the way St. Francis became a monk is he took off all of his clothing from being a rich inheritor, and he goes and gives himself to the church. So some people believe when you become a part of the church, you create new family with each other. So this argument in the book of Hebrews, which, by the way, if you didn't hear it last week, Hebrews we think is the only book of the Bible written by a woman, Priscilla, who's mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles. This is a story about Jesus being someone who's appointed a child of God, because Jesus's connection to forever family is through church community. And Melchizedek's connection to forever family is through church community, not to birth parents and birth genealogy. So it's a way of talking about how do we deal with the fact that we have different levels of power and privilege and money and resources based on our family connections or not. And this text is saying that being a part of Melchizedek is like being a part of this cool kids club of people who aren't getting their status of importance from their parents. So our connection to God is what's the most important, not the connection to other stuff in the world. But we have no idea if Melchizedek is not connected to his family because he didn't like his family, because his family didn't like him, because of any actual historical circumstance. So, Finn.
So I always like to put things into, I love the fact that you frame this so well with the background, and I had no idea that a woman possibly wrote Hebrews. That just I'm sorry, that blew my mind a little bit.
Yeah.
More than just a little bit. So just trying to recover from that moment. And then the other piece of it was that idea that you gain status through family, which is very much the way at least our society still very much works, but also that idea of disconnection and connection to a forever family, and that forever family of a church, of a community. So how that differs from a connection to a lineage of family. And so I'm going to ask a question back, which is, so then if priests come from a lineage of a community instead of a lineage of bloodlines, how does that change perspective? How does that change the way that we look at things in general and in the context of the gospel? Especially, you kind of blew my mind. Just remember that.
Well, the story was told slightly differently, kind of knowing
someone who is unowned, unattached,
sure,
son of God, not son of Joseph, not son of Mary, but son of God,
right,
has a detachment and a freedom and an ability to move and create family in a different or in another way.
Yeah. Well, and these early Christians believed that the way that they created those bonds was through communion, right? So communion was a way of creating bloodlines that aren't through birthing, right? When you drink the blood of Christ, you become a part of the genealogy of Jesus through the kiddom, right? Through all of us being children of God. And so it's a way of creating a new form of ranking and connection. During the time of Jesus, there was a lot of abuse of power that was happening. When we talk about King Herod, we're not talking about just one person. It was a whole family. They were called the Herodians. And around the time that Jesus is born, the father dies, and there are 4 sons who all compete to see who gets to be the new in charge person. And it's a bloody battle, and people take different sides. And Herodias is the one who kind of comes through. But because they are gaining, I mean, it's like any movie you've ever seen about kings or about, the immature prince who at first doesn't know what they're doing. And there's one sibling who's really just wants the power. And then there's the other sibling who's benevolent. And right, it's the story that we love to tell throughout the ages. We have the Arthur story, like all these different kinds of stories. But it's a type of just knowing that this is about a type of connecting where your power doesn't come from your status in the world. And wouldn't it make sense that a woman would write that book, right? A woman whose power and privilege doesn't come through the established order, right? Who's supposed to be in power is the firstborn son of the firstborn son of the firstborn son of the firstborn son. So if a woman gets to write the book about how power happens in the world, she might talk about family connections. She might talk about embodied experience. She might talk about the ways that people through history have bucked that system and found ways to love beyond kind of their bloodlines or beyond the violence. There's a book called Chalice and the Blade that talks about the matriarchal prehistory that a lot of people don't know about, and how they used dialogue and compassion rather than violence in order to kind of rule their time in the world. And so these might be some of the things that get written down in a book that's written by a woman. But it's also a way of, what's also happening here is Melchizedek. So there were people who thought Abraham was the best person in the story of Abraham. And there were people who thought Melchizedek was the best person in the story. Abraham gets more time in the story. Melchizedek just gets one mention, that Abraham gave him 10% of his booty, right? It's not the character in the text who gets most of the story or the power or the privilege or anything, but it gives us also a context. If you've ever said, I really relate to the bleeding woman, but the rest of those stories about Jesus, I don't get it. The book of Hebrews is saying that we can pick one character who only gets one verse, and for hundreds of years, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years by the time that this is written, that character can become important, and we can learn from them, and we can understand what God is up to through that character who only got one sentence in the text. And that's okay. And so maybe the book of Hebrews in its mentioning of Melchizedek is saying proof texting is fine. Or maybe it's saying that, find strength in the story wherever you can. It's certainly the kind of thing that people who have lived in the minority often have to live off of the scraps, right? And so if you are a minority who's reading the Bible, sometimes you have to just focus on that one sentence about that one guy, because that one sentence gives you hope, because the whole book was written by a majority of people who had a certain way of seeing the world. And so that's why I kind of lift up this idea of Melchizedek, who's talking about the ways that high priests should be working in the world. Because if you just read the text the way it's cut, you might just think, who cares? Like, what do you mean priests are supposed to do this and priests are supposed to do that? And this is who gets to be a priest. And a lot of people have read texts like this to think, oh, well, women can't be pastors because they're not a part of the priesthood in the right way. Well, first of all, it's text written by a woman who is thought to be a priestess, right? And her profession was as a teacher. And if you know that she's talking about this subversive person, and you know that she's talking about Melchizedek, it's really hard to use these same verses to try to say, well, you can't be a pastor because blah, 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 which is what people have tried to do with some of these verses. So I don't know. I think the Melchizedek stuff is kind of interesting.
It is. Thank you.
Yep.
Whole new
families are great.
I read that and I was like,
that's the dumbest. Yeah. I mean, because sometimes jerky texts aren't as jerky when you learn the context or you read the stuff around it. But most people don't know what the word, like, just know that there are some words that are to give you a clue about what's going on, because they didn't want to write things really explicitly because they were of the minority, and the people who were reading they probably weren't actually reading them, but the people who were oppressing them were going to slaughter them. If they knew that they were worshiping Jesus, they would get slaughtered. And so they would have to use key words so you'd know what's going on. Like the allegory of Legion in the Gospel of Mark. Legion is someone who has lots and lots of demons. Well, it's an allegory about wanting to murder the Roman army because of how horrible they have been to the Jewish people. But if you said, we want to murder the Roman army because of how horrible they've been, the Roman army would just come and be like, squash you out, right? But if you say there was this guy and he had a lot of demons, and Jesus came and got rid of this horrible, evil spirit that kept crushing him and put it into the pigs, which was the sign. Like, if the Romans were going to walk through your town, they were going to have a flag that had pigs on it. Boars was their theme, right? And so not wanting to eat bacon maybe was about Roman people slaughtering you all the time and not wanting to be a part of the community of the oppressors. And so it's using code words to let you know that God is on your side. And so often we forgot what the magic words are now. And then we just think that God's not on our side. And so I always want to tell people, God is on your side. If you're reading the sacred scripture and you don't get the story that God is on your side, keep reading or learn more about what the magic code words are. But don't ever believe the people who say that it's possible for God not to be on your side, because that's not scriptural. Every single text, whether it's about slaughtering people or about whatever it's about, is about God being on your side. It just is. Even when God's mad, God's still on your side. Sometimes God's like tough love. Sometimes God's like love. Sometimes God's like hugs. But God's on your side. So that's what I have to say about that. Gospel of Mark, should we talk about, speaking of Jesus's healings?
Yes.
Gospel of Mark. So this is, as someone who's worked with the homeless as long as I have, this is the parable of why aggressive panhandling is something that works for God. Right? So we often tell people they're not supposed to interrupt during church, but this is someone who is yelling at Jesus. And the context of the Gospel of Mark, this is the very last healing miracle that will happen in the Gospel of Mark. My theory about the Gospel of Mark is that Jesus runs out of power. The previous blind person that Jesus heals, Jesus has to heal them more than once. And usually when Jesus heals a blind person, he spits on the ground, makes mud, rubs the mud on their face, and then the person is able to see. The very last time in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus tried to do this, it doesn't work. And the person says, I see trees as if they were walking, and it's people, but he can't see them clearly. So Jesus has to do it a second time. In this text, you would say, well, if Jesus ran out of power, why is he healing someone again? And this one happens instantaneously. Instead of spitting and using the mud method, Jesus heals this person by saying, your faith has made you well. So words made this person healed. But it is also not Jesus doing the healing. Right? So in the past, Jesus spits in the mud, he makes this thing, he puts it up, and Jesus uses his own power to heal the person. In this circumstance, Jesus says, your faith made you well. The beggar heals himself. Jesus names what the beggar did for himself. Jesus is encouraging people to use the power they have within themselves to heal themselves. And this is consistent with what's happening with the disciples. Jesus teaches the disciples to go out and heal people. A couple of weeks ago, there was a reading from Mark where the disciples come back and they say, we've run out of power and we are no longer able to heal people. But those people down the street, they keep healing people, and they didn't study with you and they don't know anything and they keep healing people. And Jesus says, if you buy into my theory that Jesus runs out of power in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus basically is saying, anybody who's got power left, for goodness sake, let them use it. Who cares what they're saying? Who cares if they've studied from me? Let them use the power that they have. And so it's possible that we're witnessing a transformation in how healing happens. So instead of only being able to be healed if you can touch Jesus, if you can get close enough to Jesus, Jesus is teaching others to heal, right? First, he teaches the people who are closest to him, like the pastors. Here's how you heal. Go out and do this in the same way that I have. And then other people start to learn how they can heal. And Jesus is like, great. Who cares if they know the right words or they've read the right text? As long as they're doing good things in the world, I'm on their side. And now this is a story where Jesus is teaching people to heal themselves without ever having to touch Jesus, which would be helpful. If Jesus is going to die and not be around anymore, then we need to know how we can do these things without Jesus being present. Otherwise, you'd always have to grab the hem of Jesus in order to heal yourself. And if Jesus isn't physically in the world, then there would be no way for God to heal you anymore. So this is a transformation that is saying, do what you can to heal yourself. Do what you can to heal others. And we might not always be able to do it. Our power might run out sometimes. We might run out of steam or run out of self-care and need to refuel our power. But We need to figure out how to do the best we can for ourselves and how to do the best we can for other people. So that's my initial reading. What were you going to say, Finn?
So I like this whole continuity of the healing stories of Jesus heals, and then sometimes it requires touch, sometimes it requires touch from Jesus, sometimes it requires just touching the hem of Jesus's garment, sometimes it's the disciples doing the healing, but now all of a sudden it's the person in need, person asking for healing, that's doing the healing. But then what Jesus says is, Jesus then says, it's done. Your faith has made it so. Now go. Almost as if he's saying, now go. You have the same power as what I have had, I have taught my disciples. Now you, through your faith, have that same power to go and heal others. It's not owned by anybody.
Right.
You get to experience it, and then you get to give it and go out with that healing. And I love that, the beauty of that, just continuity, especially after the last Hebrews reading. It was like, I don't like this whole priest thing.
So if we think about this, if we think of Jesus's time on earth being a disruption to the power system, if we think of it less as like, okay, so the most important person is because you have the last name of someone who's been a president before, and so that's how we know who's going to be the winner. We don't even need to have the election. We know who's going to win because you have the last name of someone who's been the president before. This interrupts all of that, right? It means that the aggressive panhandler is as a powerful healer as Jesus is, right? And so our connections to community and our access to the gifts of God are available to anyone, regardless of whether or not they've been ordained or not. And in the Lutheran Church, we call this the priesthood of all believers. We're not perfect in how we do it, but in our thinking, we believe everyone is a priest. Anyone can bless anyone else, and it has just as much weight as if the Pope did it. Anyone can talk at the pulpit or read the scripture or hand out communion, but we believe that there are some people who are elected by the community of faithful people rather than by their last name or appointed by a powerful bishop or something like that, that there are elected people whom we choose to hear from more often, right? So we elect a pastor to preach to us. We elect a pastor to ensure that our sacraments are done in a way that will honor the ancient echoes that come from our ancestors, so that the way we share bread and wine is knit together with the way people shared bread and wine all the way back up to Jesus. Not because there are magic words that make it so. We don't say you have to use these exact words or it doesn't count, as some other faithful people might say. If you don't say the holy, 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 it's not really communion, right? Lutherans believe that we try to stay in the wisdom of the ancestors, and we try to use enough of the language that it feels like we're a part of this church community that we're creating together, right? We want to be diverse and we want to welcome all people, but we also want to have ways that if I went to church at her church up the street, a Lutheran congregation that uses feminist language, I want there to be enough of the communionness there that if I go to Christ Church, which only uses Lord language, that we're a part of the same community or the same bloodline that comes from Jesus, and that we're not at war with each other needlessly, right? So there's diversity in the way that we can talk about how we celebrate these sacraments, but each community gets to kind of elect the person who's just going to be the steward of those gifts from God. We don't give pastors the ability to decide who is sinful and who's not. Only God gets to do that. And in fact, in the Lutheran Church, our Book of Confessions says, if someone confesses to me as a pastor, and I think they don't deserve God's forgiveness, their sin is not theirs anymore because God has forgiven them. And we are assured of this through the sacred text. We're assured of this through our faith. We're assured of this through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. We're assured of this through our baptism. And so if I don't want to forgive that person, their sins are now my sin. I carry them, not them. And it's my job to figure out how I can forgive that person. It's not a fracture in that person's relationship with God. So I don't have the power to decide who's good and bad. I only have the power to be a good steward over baptism, to be a good steward over communion, to be a good steward over the way that I ponder on behalf of the community. And so there are a lot of hoops and jumps and dumb things that it will feel like you have to do to get trained to be someone who can officially be approved to be one of these electable people. Part of that is because we've also had experiences where we have been really loose with who can be elected as a pastor. And back in 1963, before her church was her church, Ebenezer Lutheran Church had a pastor who committed suicide between the 9 a.m. service and the 11 a.m. service by jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. Unfortunately, during this time period, they can't even recall how many people jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge who were pastors because it was so many. But in Ebenezer Lutheran, the reason the pastor jumps off the bridge between the 9 a.m. service and the 11 a.m. service is because the women in the church were discovering how many of the women the pastor was dating. Right? And it created a very difficult situation. And so this was resolved through the generations, not necessarily by fixing all of the traumas of the women who had unfortunate things happen to them. And certainly the pastor who jumped off the bridge never got resolution within their lifetime for what was going on in this circumstance. But that congregation, by becoming her church, has said that femininity and protecting women is of utmost importance. And they have found ways to express the ways that God is with them and for them. And they've done that in response to this way that they have been abused and were vulnerable people. And so some people, not knowing that history of why this particular type of healing needed to happen in this particular building, might think, oh, they're just radical and oh, they're not even Christian. But this is their response to heal from the traumas that they've experienced in the world. And other places have different kinds of traumas that they're responding to and healing from. But a lot of the hoops and the classes that many contemporary pastors have to go through before they can be officially sanctioned is to try to prevent this kind of abuse in the future. Because we believe that once you become a pastor, you're a pastor forever. And unless you do something very damaging and are put on trial and are found guilty, this pastorhood will not be removed from you. And we would rather make people go through ridiculous hoops and jumps and requirements and paperwork and find out before they do damage in a congregation that they're not able to hold good boundaries than have someone accidentally slip through the cracks and harm an entire congregation in the process. And so that's just my word for any of the people who are studying to become pastors in the world. If you are frustrated by all of the stupid paperwork and rules that don't make any sense, know that only part of it is about you. In fact, most of it is not about you at all. Most of it is about wanting to care for congregations who have experienced unimaginable trauma when pastors in the past have not been able to love them and care for them in a way that was safe for them in all of the ways. And so we don't have good examples of Jesus having really firm boundaries. There's no sermon of the boundaries that Jesus ever says where he's like, do not do bad things to other people and just be servants, because he's leaving places really quickly. He goes there, he heals, he leaves, right? So he doesn't necessarily have to tell the stories about what you do when people start whatevering, or, you know, there's no story of, and then Jesus got in an inappropriate relationship in Capernaum and it was a problem and we had to go, right? All of those messy issues are not new to our church. They're all written down in the Acts of the Apostles. The Acts of the Apostles is the second half of the book of Luke. all of the books were written on scrolls, and the scroll got too big, so they had to break it into two. It didn't fit to wind it all up in the same thing. So the Acts of the Apostles, they have every single one of these problems. And so, all the rich people would come to commune. They would have a potluck church, and they didn't want to share their rich, fancy foods with the poorer people who were a part of their community, because they didn't bring, it wasn't fair. They brought food that was less expensive. And so the poor people were coming and they were eating all the fancy foods. And so the richer people tried to have their potluck church earlier in the day when the other people had to work, so that they would have to have a separate potluck lunch and just eat their poor people food. Well, in the Acts of the Apostles, they decide you have to have just one big meal, and you don't have to share each other's food, and you need to deal with it, right? So almost every conflict that you can think about happens in the Acts of the Apostles. And so as a church, we're trying to figure out how we can suck less all the time, how we can stop doing damage in big communities. And it's not perfect. There are still pastors who have inappropriate sexual relationships with members of their congregation. There are still people who say dumb things that offend people and are hurtful. There are still congregations that need to work on being welcoming of LGBT people. And I will need to work on whatever the next group of marginalized people is that I haven't even noticed is marginalized yet. And they're going to work for their rights kind of in the next generation or as it's coming. And so I just wanted to say that little word about how the priesthood works in the Lutheran Church and why it's convoluted sometimes. And if you're just a regular churchgoer and you didn't know all of that, know that it takes between 3 and 5 years for pastors to get trained, in part so that there can be people who just observe people for that long of a period of time and try to ensure that they're going to be the best that they can. Because if everyone in the church is a child of God, we want to make sure that those who are parenting, if the church is the children of God and there's someone who's in charge and they're the pastor, then we're parents of the children of God. Then I guess God's the real parent. Maybe we're babysitters. We're babysitters. That we're taking as best care as we can of God's children. And my hope is that any pastors out there who are listening, think of the work you do. Think of your need not to cause harm as being a babysitter. If you were babysitting God's kids, like for real, if God rang your doorbell one day and was like, will you babysit my kids? I'm going to the movies. You would do an amazing job with God's kids if you had to babysit them, right? So that's my thoughts on that. That was a really long diatribe that might not have applied to a lot of people, but it happened. Anyway, I don't know. I like the Gospel of Mark. I think it's fun. What, do you have any other thoughts, Finn? I talked a really long time.
I'm good. I'm good. You know, someone who's in the process of becoming a pastor, and the loops and the hoops and jumping and leaping and watching and waiting.
It's exhausting. It's exhausting.
Everybody
pray for Finn. Do it.
It's an exhausting process.
Yeah.
Yes.
I like your sweater.
Well, thank you.
That's a thing.
Thanks.
All right. What else? I don't know. I guess that can probably be enough for today. What do you think? Oh, I'll say this last thing.
Can we talk about,
go ahead.
This weekend Reformation Sunday?
Oh, yeah. That's a thing.
And isn't it like some significant anniversary of that?
Next year. Next year is the 500 year. Next year, 2017, October 2017. So 2 years.
2 years. Okay.
October 2017 is going to be Reformation's 500th anniversary. Pastor Amanda and I talked a little bit about that. I've been doing some work with the folk at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary, which is the baby pastor school in Berkeley. And Finn goes there. And we will be working on some readings that if you want to learn more about Martin Luther, there'll be a series of readings for a year. We're going to start in October of 2016 and do activities through October 2017. We're going to do justice events throughout our whole Northern California / Nevada region of the Lutheran Church, and maybe in some other places around the country. Wait for it. It's going to be amazing. And we'll do a lot of that through live streaming, and it's going to be really fun. So there'll be a lot of activities that will be happening on our justlutheran.blogspot.com space.
So will you explain quickly what Reformation Sunday is? You will likely sing, if you go to a Lutheran church, what song?
A Mighty Fortress.
Yes.
I just sang a version of that song that was a new, I don't know if it's a new translation, but a nicer version written, the lyrics by Jeff Johnson, one of the pastors in Berkeley. My favorite version of A Mighty Fortress, if you're looking for a version of A Mighty Fortress, is the isometric lyrics to A Mighty Fortress from the Presbyterian hymnal. Don't use the isometric rhythm in the thing, because it'll be like dun 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 dun, like, and it won't make sense. So don't use those notes, but use those words, because there's a verse about like God ending nuclear war, and I think it's amazing. So the Reformation was the time when Martin Luther nailed some theses up to a wall and created kind of a 4-year revolution, questioning the idea of, is the Pope infallible? Do we have to do everything the Pope says? One of the things that they argued about was sexuality. All of the celibate monks and nuns, Martin Luther became a matchmaker, and he married them off to each other, because back then he believed that celibacy was a bad idea that got pastors in trouble for many of the reasons that we talked about in our boundaries conversation. So getting married and having sex was an important part of the Reformation. An important part of the Reformation was this idea that church could be in your own language. It used to be that church was only in Latin and no one understood the Latin. They'd just go there, and only the priest would take communion, and the people didn't get to take communion. So part of the Reformation was saying the people get to have access to all of the elements. Part of the Reformation was about being angry and killing people who didn't deserve it. A lot of the things that were quoted in the Holocaust were things that Martin Luther said during the Reformation. Wah, wah. And so there's really difficult, oppressive things that Martin Luther also did during this time period that we need to be honest and think about in our intersections of justice. Lots of different groups that he threw under the bus and said, kill them, not me. The Mennonites and the Anabaptists being some of those folk. The Reformation was about aligning with political leaders and making stupid agreements so that you don't get killed. And it was also about drinking a lot of beer. Martin Luther transformed after all of the monks and nuns got married. He lived in a monastery with his wife Katie, who had been a nun who refused to marry anyone else but him, and they created a brewery and a bowling alley inside their monastery because they were very lonely, and so they would drink a lot of beer, and he would write a lot of stuff. And so it's about connecting to God on your own. The priesthood of all believers was one of the big things that happened during the Reformation. When my grandmother was growing up in South Dakota, Reformation Sunday was called Kick a Catholic Day. Ooh. Right? Because there was still a lot of animosity between the Lutherans and the Catholics. My grandma was told that she could date anyone she wanted as long as they were Lutheran and not Catholic. And so some of these divisions are more recent than we might think. We now have a lot of call to common understandings with each other, and we can partner with each other. There's an agreement saying that when there isn't a Lutheran church around, Lutherans can go and have communion at the Catholic Church, and when there isn't a Catholic church around, Catholics can go and have communion at the Lutheran Church. We haven't really mended a lot of the other fences. Most of the things that Martin Luther wanted fixed in his 95 Theses have now been fixed in the Catholic Church. And so some of us have a new list. There's people who are working on the new 95 Theses, a women's theological group that's writing up today's 95 Theses. And There are people who are going to gather in Germany and remember this history. Many people will celebrate this in Lutheran churches as kind of just like a way to celebrate the fact that we're Lutheran, and eat culturally Lutheran things, whatever that means for your congregation. Some people that means eating German food. For some people that means Norwegian food. Some people that means whatever it means for you, for however your Lutheranism came through the United States and how that's documented. My hope is that it inspires you to think about the fact that you get to be diverse in this church, that you get to have a God who's on your side, and that you don't have to know the right answers to any darn questions that exist in the world, and you still get to claim that you are a Lutheran, and you still get to hold the world accountable to try to bring justice in the world. Martin Luther created welfare. He also created a lot of the protections for children that existed. And so it was a time not only of thinking about how the church could reform, but thinking about how cities could reform, how we could treat people who are poor better, how we could treat anyone who is vulnerable better. So anything that helps make vulnerable people's lives better is within the spirit of Reformation theology. That's what I think is happening. I get more excited about All Saints Sunday, which is the first Sunday in November, when we get to remember our ancestors who have been lost. I'm going to finish up my saints paintings by then, and we celebrate people from all times and places that were important to the members of our congregation, and that can be a really intense time. And reminds me again that we should pray for Pastor Amanda during the loss in their family.
And Creating Sacred Spaces for All Saints Day, which we'll do on Wednesday, we'll be asking people to share stories of saints from their own lives.
Yeah. If you don't know of any of the LGBT saints, it's a shameless plug, but I've been thinking about it lately, is back in 2009, I published a bunch of essays that I wrote while I was at Baby Pastor School. It's called Queerly Lutheran. And in the second appendix of the book has over 200 terms for sacred transgender people that have existed throughout history. The first appendix is actually a prayer calendar of the LGBT saints who have gone before us. So some of them are contemporary. So it's Lutherans that were a part of the LGBT movement that led to the full inclusion of LGBT pastors in the contemporary Lutheran Church, and some of them are much older. Some of the 13 transgender saints that were honored by the ancient Catholic Church, or popes that were known to be bisexual. Some of them are fascinating, like King James. Did you know that the first appearance of language that was against LGBT or LNG stuff, like where the first time the word homosexuality or something like homosexuality appears in the negative in a Bible is in the King James Version, because people were trying to say mean things about the king and they didn't want to get beheaded. So they put it in their Bible translation, even though it had never been there before and probably isn't there in the ancient language. And so they were trying to say, because King James was bisexual, that he was ungodly. And so that's one of the first times that language comes into the Bible. So if you're interested in it, you can get it on Amazon Kindle or whatever you want to do. You don't actually have to get it. You could just probably Google a lot of those things. But if you're interested in celebrating an All Saints Sunday that has more diverse saints than you imagined, that's a good one. Wilgefortis is a good saint. Look her up. She grows a beard and doesn't have to marry a man she doesn't like because she grows a beard. It's great. The end. I'm going to fall asleep if we keep talking. So thanks for hanging in there. Hopefully you didn't fall asleep. And thank you for being a part of our Order of Melchizedek. See how I did that? All right. Take care, everybody.